Hi, so here in our fourth video on Islam, I want to think with you about what happened after Muhammad. And we've thought about this before, haven't we? That when Buddha died, there was a struggle to define what happened next. And sure, there was the Theravada movement, then out of that broke the Mahayana movement, and the splintering just continued. We saw that with the time of Jesus, that Jesus had his brother James running things in Jerusalem. Then there's this guy called Paul coming out of the Roman world. And then there's the other disciple, Peter, who has his own lane and his own agenda and mission statement, if you will. And so the early decades after the death of a spiritual leader of these calibers is problematic. And it's no different here. When Muhammad died, he did not appoint a successor. And so a schism developed between some of his friends and some of his family members. And that ended up evolving into what today we call Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. And Shia or Shiite is the minority. Only 10, maybe 15% of the world is Shia. 90% of the world is Sunni Muslim. And they each have their own lineage of teachers, and through the centuries, of course, some differences and distinctions arose in the way that they practiced. But like any other major world religion, there's a lot more diversity than that. There's not just two ways of being a Muslim, of course. But it's kind of like talking about Christianity and saying, well, there's Catholics and there's Protestants and there's Orthodox. Well, there's a lot more than that going on, isn't there? Like I said, most of the world is Sunni, which makes it all the more intriguing when you notice that Shia Islam is the official religion of Iran. And Iraq is also, by a large majority, a Shia nation or Shiite nation. And occasionally those distinctions result in flare-ups and disagreements, of course, as you can imagine. So that's, I suppose, the big headline about what happened after the death of Muhammad is the Shia and Sunni split. But there's so many other moments we could notice. I want to draw your attention to the Sufis. So Sufi Islam or Sufism, the word Sufi comes from the word meaning wool, for the wool garments that they wore. Sufism is a mystical form of Islam. And like mystics in any other religion, like Christian mystics or Jewish mystics, etc., mystics are in a way alike, no matter what religion they find themselves in. Mystics typically want to experience directly the divine. So they're not as interested in liturgy and institution and the authority and the hierarchy of some sort of, priests or imams in this case. So there is in Sufism a kind of, like there is in all mysticism, a kind of baked in seditiousness and heresy. The Sufis don't want to follow Muhammad. They want to experience what Muhammad experienced. And so the Sufis, like mystics and other traditions, are often branded as heretics, as dangerous threats to the orthodoxy, to the mainstream. And there have been periods in Islamic history of great and violent persecution of Sufism. But that's not certainly always the case. And to this day, Sufism survives as a beautiful kind of alternative form of Islam. Some of the most popular poets in the world, Rumi and Hafiz, which is how they're known here in the West, come from the Sufi tradition. Now, we also need to make room here in our consideration of what happens in Islam after Muhammad for Islamic fundamentalism. Now, there's some controversy around that word, around that label, because to be precise, fundamentalism is a Protestant Christian movement. But we sort of, if we could play loose for a minute here, we sort of use that word fundamentalism to describe any sect within a religion that has certain qualities, that checks certain boxes. And so Where did Islamic fundamentalism come from? Some scholars argue that in the vacuum, in the leadership vacuum left by the disappearance of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, right, this huge conglomeration from the 1400s to the early 20th century, ran things in much of the Muslim, not all, but much of the Muslim world. And when that collapsed, and what's also happening in the 17th, 18th, and 19th and 20th century is imperialism and colonialism. And during the great period of colonial conquest, when what we call Arabia and Africa and so much of the world, India, here in North America, was conquered by the British and the Belgians and the French and the Dutch and others, the whole continent of Africa. That colonial period was a painful time for all of the native indigenous peoples of those lands. And perhaps some scholars argue in response to that colonial conquest and to fill the leadership vacuum left by the disappearance of the Ottoman Empire, and frankly, in response to the outright blatant robbery of vast national resources, raw materials, and especially with the discovery of oil and our complete global reliance because of the internal combustion engine on this substance. I mean, that just changes everything, right? So you kind of put all these factors into the bowl and you mix them, and what you see are, in some extreme factional corners, the rise of an increasingly militant nationalistic response to all of that foreign invasion and thievery. A little bit like the Zealots in the time of the Greek and especially the Roman occupation of Jerusalem. You know, the Zealots, of all the Jewish sects, the Zealots took it upon themselves to pick up weapons, to pick up arms, and to go to war against the empire, against Rome. And so you see a little bit of that energy in some of these extremist movements that come to be known in the 20th century and then now in the 21st as Islamic fundamentalism or terrorism. And like all fundamentalist movements, Islamic fundamentalism longs for a mythical past that it wishes to return to. I mean, that's how all fundamentalists talk. That's how Jewish fundamentalists talk, if you could call them that. Let's just maybe not use that phrase, because strictly what I'm going to say next about fundamentalism leaves Judaism out. So I'm getting ahead of myself. But certainly in, say, Protestant Christian fundamentalism, there is often a longing to return to a biblical time of purity, of tradition. Let's go back to this past. And the problem with that is that, A, that mythical past never really existed quite the way fundamentalists characterize it, and B, you can't go back to the past ever anyway. But that longing, that sort of nostalgic longing for the past is one of the features of fundamentalism. The second one is a literal reading of texts. That's where the word really comes from. To read sacred texts literally. So creationism in Christianity is a fundamentalist idea, reading the creation myth in the book of Genesis as if it were a historical document, a scientific paper. And that is always a tension in every religion. Should we read scripture literally, or should we interpret it rationally or even metaphorically? So we've touched on that before as it's come up from time to time in our discussion of other religious traditions. And here it is again. So in some Islamic fundamentalist movements, then there's also the justification of violence if it is understood as self-defense. And who does not defend self-defense? This is built into our legal system. It's certainly a part of Jewish law. And in the Talmud, there's a line about, if you know that someone is coming to your house to kill you, you have not only the right, but the moral obligation to meet them on the road and kill them. the rights of the right to life of the one with murderous intent is lower than the right to life of the victim of that murderous intent. So you can use deadly force to defend yourself against murderous intent. We all agree with that, legally and morally. And so in fundamentalist Islamic terrorism, as we call it in the West sometimes, or in these extremist groups, they simply define their violence as self-defense. Even 9/11, in the consciousness of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, was couched as a response, not an attack, as a defensive maneuver to deal a deadly blow to the West, which it saw as a hostile aggressor that was threatening its way of life. Now, as an American citizen, as a non-Muslim, as someone who grew up right across the river from Manhattan in West Paterson, New Jersey, when I watched those towers fall, I mean, that felt like, I'll never forget it. And I know a lot of you know what I mean, who were alive during that time. It's difficult intellectually to understand that attack as self-defense. But now, learning more and more about the complexity of all these issues, you can certainly understand the consciousness of the attackers. We obviously don't condone, approve, or in any way give our assent to that kind of horror. Who could? But we are struggling here and right now in this inquiry to understand how people can get so desperate to do something like that. And there's a certain urgency around trying to struggle with that question. When we think about Islamic fundamentalism, we follow the thread right to one particular person named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And Abdul Wahhab lived in 1703 to 1792 in Saudi Arabia. Al-Wahhab, the namesake of Wahhabism or Wahhabi Islam, is a fascinating figure, and I think an important figure to consider as we struggle with this question. So he was a conservative cleric in Saudi Arabia, 300 years ago, and he taught a very strict and austere form of Islam. And he made some crucial early alliances with the Saudi royal family, which have been maintained to this day. And so, in other words, Saudi Arabia today, Wahhabi Islam is the official form of Sunni Islam in Saudi Arabia. There's the answer to your question. Why is Saudi Arabia so weirdly, strictly observant and so deeply conservative compared to other predominantly Muslim places? Saudi Arabia has the strictest rules of nearly any other nation or society on earth that is predominantly Muslim. And it's because Wahhabism. So Wahhabism may be the official religion of Saudi Arabia, but you know what? It's viewed quite negatively by all the other Sunni and Shia Muslims in the world. They're a little scared of it, largely because Wahhabism teaches that all other forms of Islam are wrong, that they are false, that they are heretical, they are too soft, they are too moderate, they are not strict enough. And one of the things that Wahhabi Islam is most known for is the stark and sometimes violent opposition to what it calls idolatry. And we remember that from the second commandment in the book of Exodus in the Torah. No graven images. And we noticed back then in our discussion of Judaism, both in Judaism and in Islam, that idea is still maintained, but nowhere more strictly than in Wahhabi Islam. All forms of what it calls idolatry are despised and eradicated, including ancestor veneration, including tomb visitation, including birthday celebrations. You know, it reminds me of some of our Jehovah's Witness and Seventh-day Adventist friends who don't do birthdays for that same reason, because they believe it draws too much attention to ourselves and thereby draws attention away from God. Check this out. You recall that Mecca, Saudi Arabia, is the birthplace of Muhammad. And you recall that there's no one more important in all Islam than the Prophet Muhammad, through whom the Quran came. In their prohibition of ancestor worship and tomb visitation, under the control of Wahhabi Islam, the tomb of Muhammad has been razed to the ground. It doesn't exist anymore. They destroyed it. Imagine going to Washington, D.C. and tearing down the Lincoln Memorial. This is the ideology of Wahhabi Islam that just doesn't sit right with most of the world's Muslims, who like to go to funerals, who like to think kindly about their deceased imams and so on, and certainly pay homage to the great Prophet Muhammad. So, like a lot of other fundamentalist Islam, in Wahhabism, there is a literal translation, a literal interpretation of the Quran. And so all of that bristling aggression just doesn't sit well with most of the other Muslims in the world. And I'm taking the time to go through this with you, not to point fingers at all of Islam, but quite the opposite, to, I hope by now, demonstrate how pluralistic, multicultural, and diverse Islam is, just like every other religion is that we've studied. When you look at a religion as big as Islam, 1.6 billion people, 25% of Earth, 25% of human beings are Muslims. You're not going to get them all into one box. How could you? And so Wahhabism is a sort of bracing window into one particular iteration, a very potent iteration, but one particular iteration or version of Islam. You know who was really influenced by Wahhabism? Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden, coming out of Yemen and with deep ties to Saudi Arabia. You know that 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. So there is certainly a thread of concern that runs directly from al-Wahhab through Osama bin Laden and right up to today, right up to ISIS. Classic fundamentalism. According to every Muslim I know, the people in ISIS are terrible Muslims. They break every rule. But they define themselves as the saviors of Islam, as the only one with the guts to go to war against anything that stands in the way of the restoration of the caliphate. There's that fundamentalist dream of returning back to some sort of past that they imagine once existed, in which they will be the winners. And fundamentalism to me is just a mirror held up to all of us and our own tendencies for conquest, for arrogance, for control. We have to think about one more thing, and that is this word jihad. Jihad is a potent, beautiful, but in the mouths of some, toxic idea. So let's trace the quick history of it. Jihad in the mouth of Muhammad meant an inner struggle. My jihad is to become a disciplined, kind, spiritual person. You know, the inner struggle to be good is how Muhammad framed the word jihad. The word just means struggle. But as the centuries went on, certain Islamic rulers began to use it more generally and more broadly to mean our struggle to defend ourselves against the non-Muslim. And then you get right up to today, to terror groups like ISIS. They love the word and they use it. That's their banner, right? We are the jihad. In other words, we give ourselves the right, ISIS says, to slaughter anyone, anywhere, in the name of furthering our political and ideological aim. But as one of my students from Saudi Arabia told me once, he said, you know, ISIS is our KKK. They don't speak for us. He said, they don't speak for me. It's an aberration. It's a distortion. It's an opposition and a contradiction to what the core values of Islam really are: humility, spirituality, compassion, care, community, forgiveness. There are lost souls in all religions. There are violent terrorists in all religions. When we see horror, our struggle is to look past the label that those perpetrators put on themselves and dig down, drill down to see what is really going on. One of my Saudi students put it this way. He said, you know what jihad means to me? He says, my jihad is to get an A in this class to honor my mother and father who paid a lot of money to send me to college in America. My jihad is to become a more compassionate person, to stop trying to hold on to my money and to be more generous in giving my money to the poor. That's my jihad, he said. I'll never forget that. That's the sense in which Muhammad meant jihad. So I mentioned the Sufis before, and I want to leave you with a poem by one of my favorite Sufi mystic poets named Hafiz. And he lived 1320 to 1389 from Persia, today what would we call Iran. This is the classic mystical manifesto, the classic statement that real spirituality goes beyond all labels. So here's a poem called I Have Learned So Much by Hafiz. I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew. The truth has shared so much of itself with me that I can no longer call myself a man, a woman, an angel, or even a pure soul. Love has befriended Hafiz so completely, it has turned to ash and freed me of every concept and image my mind has ever known. There, in the fire of transcendent consciousness, ideology is transcended, self is transcended, definitions and labels are transcended. We find ourselves then in that place where all paths meet, as Ramakrishna said in his Hindu consciousness. All religions lead to the summit, many paths to the summit. And as the ancient Vedas put it, the truth is one. The sages call it by many names. And when we consider all the work that we've done around world religions, we are left with a stack of maps. And all the maps lead maybe to a similar place. There's another great poem by another Sufi master called Rumi. And just a little part of it, he says, out beyond all ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And when the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about.